First of all, I'd like to do some introductions. Senator Mimi Walters from the 33rd District will be joining us a little later. She's running a little late. To my right, I'd like to introduce Bill Polasek, retired Contra Costa County Treasurer and Tax Collector. And further to my right, Dr. Lenny Ebenstein, California Center of Public Policy. Ted Costa of People's Advocate, and Marcia Fritz, CPA, California Foundation for the Fiscal Responsibility. And I'd also like to introduce Betty Cosby, our Chamber President and CEO. And Betty's going to be our timekeeper this morning. And then I'd like to introduce some people from the audience. First of all, City Council Member Jana Karpinski-Costa. Thank you, Jana. Senate Republican Office of Policy, Gary Link. Let's see, I'd like to introduce our location host, Karen Luthke of USC. Karen, good morning. And, okay, were you going to speak now? Okay, thank you.
Well, good morning, everybody. We're glad to have you here today. I'm Karen Luthke. I manage communications and marketing for the Saul Price School of Public Policy here at USC in Sacramento. And just wanted to let you know that here in Sacramento, students can earn a Master of Public Administration. You're sitting in one of the classrooms, and our program is tailored predominantly to working professionals. So I left you all a brochure that I hope you will take a moment to look at. And if you want any further information about that program or about the center here, I'd be glad to talk with you. So mainly we just wanted to say welcome, and it will be interesting to hear the discussion on pension reform. Thanks.
Thank you, Karen. And now I'd like to introduce our premier event sponsor, Lenny Ebenstein.
Okay. Well, on behalf of the California Center for Public Policy, we'd like to thank everyone for being here today, and I look forward to the conversation and participating in it. So that's all I have to say.
Thank you. And now I'll introduce Marcia Fritz, our moderator, and I'm going to read a short bio for Marcia. Marcia Fritz, CPA, previous owner of the CPA firm now known as Fritz Russell CPAs, based in Citrus Heights. Marcia is a member of the Governmental Accounting Standards Board Task Force on Pension and Accounting and Reporting. GASB establishes the rules that public agencies in the United States are required to follow in accounting for and representing financial transactions to the public. Founder and president of the California Foundation of Fiscal Responsibility, a 501c3 that researches and educates the public and decision makers on public pensions and promotes solutions to handling pension costs when promises made and related obligations incurred exceed the public's ability to pay without cuts in services, increases in taxes, or insolvency. Longtime resident of the Sacramento region, direct descendant of two pioneer families, one of whose property was originally a chicken farm on the site of the Rose Garden in Capitol Park. Let me introduce Marcia Fritz.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm really happy that we're having this event. Our 501c3 was formed specifically for education and research of the public and elected officials and decision makers on public pensions in California, in California, and we are impacting things nationwide. I am, as he mentioned, I am on the GASB task force, and this week the board is voting on new standards that will take effect immediately for changing the way we report our costs and our liabilities related to promises that we've made to our public employees. And for some, it's going to be a shock when they see that liability put on their balance sheet, and the real cost, regardless of what we're paying into pension systems, will be reflected. And I saw this problem years ago about 8 years ago when I heard the term 3% 50. And what that means is a benefit that we promise to many of our public safety, that for every year they work, they get 3% of their final pay when they retire, plus cost of living increases, which means for a cop or a firefighter, for example, they work 30 years and they will earn 90% of their final pay when they retire, and this can happen at as early as age 50. I instinctively knew that that was going to be a problem and proceeded to address the problem with the Governmental Accounting Standards Board. And I think to shut me up, they appointed me to their task force. But as a result, we are getting very, very comprehensive reform that I'm sure we're going to get a full vote of the board, and I'm very happy with what's transpired over that effort. So with that in mind, we're going to be talking about what's going on in California related to pensions, and I'd like to introduce our first speaker since Mimi's running late. It's going to be Bill Polachek, who also is on our board. Bill was, as we mentioned, was the Contra Costa County Treasurer, but most importantly, Bill served on the Contra Costa County Employees Retirement Association Board of Trustees for many years and was a member of the Legislative Committee for State Association of County Retirement Systems. SACERA, it's different than CalPERS. We've got 37 Act county systems in addition to CalPERS, CalSTRS, and UC that operate independently. And Bill was on that board. So what he's going to talk about is how our pension costs are impacting our local services, and I've given him a series of questions to hopefully respond to in his time that he has to talk. So, Bill?
Thank you, Marcia. Just so everyone knows, I was not a lifetime government employee. I spent almost 30 years with two major California banks in the credit policy, credit examination area. So I have a little perspective from both the private sector and the public sector. When I first became county treasurer, tax collector in 1999, the county's retirement costs were under $50 million a year. For fiscal year 2011-12, they're projected to be $229 million and are expected to increase to $288 million by fiscal 2017-18. In Contra Costa County, for every dollar being spent on salary, we spend 40 cents on pensions and another 41 cents on other benefits, according to the budget presentation last year. And for our fire district, the total employee benefit cost is 103% of salary. Now, for anyone that owns a private business themselves, if you have 100% benefit cost, you're not in business anymore. With the enactment of Senate Bill 400 and Assembly Bill 616, providing for the enhanced retirement benefits and their adoption by almost every local government agency in California, most agencies, 10 years later, are facing severe budget cuts, resulting in drastic reductions in social programs and services, public protection, and general government services. One only needs to look at what's happened in Vallejo and now what is playing out in Stockton. Many other cities and counties are in similar financial crisis, including California's largest city, the city of Los Angeles. In the Stanford Institute for Economic Policy Research report, Shrinking Services, Public Pension Costs and Their Impact on San Jose, it concluded that, quote, contribution rates, the share of payroll that state government sponsors of pension plans pay each year, are likely to double over the next 4 years, crowding out spending on parks and recreation, community services, library, street maintenance, and other services. Bearing new revenues, pension spending is likely to rise from its current 18.4% share of the general fund to 32.7%. Similar conclusions have been reached by many local government officials and their finance officers. The mayor of Long Beach, Bob Foster, said at a conference in San Francisco last year that if we don't get meaningful pension reform soon, within 10 years, his city will be providing only 2 services, police and fire. Everything else will be eliminated. In the city of San Jose, police and fire budgets now take up 75% of all discretionary spending, according to Mayor Chuck Reed. Jeff Adachi, the public defender for the city of San Francisco, has had to cut his budget 10% to 15% annually over the last 4 to 5 years to pay for the increase in pension and health care costs. This means fewer attorneys to help those who need legal services the most. Mr. Adachi is an unabashed progressive who believes in social programs and services. He states if you are a true liberal, pension reform should be at the top of your list because for every dollar going to increase pension costs is coming out of social programs and services. We've seen major cutbacks in law enforcement, public safety, libraries, senior and youth programs, street maintenance. In some agencies, offices are only open 4 days a week, or there are mandatory furlough days for budgetary consideration. And financially, it's not going to get better anytime soon for local government as the housing market has failed to recover and probably won't for the next generation, and sales tax revenues have not increased as expected. Government employees would have you believe they are underpaid. If, however, you look at the public sector versus private sector compensation, you find that in 2009, average compensation for state and local government workers was $39.66 per hour, while private sector was $27.42 an hour. In other words, public sector employees make 45% more in salary and benefits than private sector employees. And this comes from the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics, which I don't think is some right-wing organization. While Republicans eventually adopted the, while the governor took bold steps with his 12-point pension reform plan in October 2011, it only addressed about 5% of the problem because most of the reforms only affect new employees. Since then, the governor's been fairly silent on the issue. Many of us were hoping for a legislative deal that could be achieved, but it appears not. And while the Republicans eventually adopted the governor's plan and introduced legislation to enact it, the Public Employee Union-controlled state legislature, for all intents and purposes, sidetracked it by referring it to a conference committee. They've held several hearings, but little is known about the eventual outcome. So where are we now? Stephen Frates, a senior fellow at the Rose Institute of State and Local Government at the Claremont McKenna College, states, there's been a wealth transfer. It has gone from the citizens to the people in government. You often hear people in government cry that there are going to be cuts and we're hurting the poor and the little children. The fact of the matter is that citizens of the state, county, and city are making life better, not necessarily for school children or people in need, but for government employees. An LA Daily News editorial said it best. No one denies that public employees should be paid fairly for their services, but the current pension system affords them benefits unheard of to most of the hardworking Californians who pay the bills. And the purpose of government shouldn't be to enrich a lucky few, but to benefit all. Do you want me to go on, Marcia?
Thank you. Yeah, what I'd like you to talk about a little bit is some of the abuses that you witnessed in your system that may or may not have been addressed by Governor Brown's 12-step plan, or 12-point plan. I'm sorry, he doesn't like it being called 12-step because it sounds like we're alcoholics. So.
Well, if you're going to criticize the system, you have to have a solution. And so what should real pension reform include? The first is honest numbers. Public pension systems rely on overly optimistic earnings assumption and recognize market losses over ridiculously long periods of time. For example, CalPERS uses a 7.5% assumed investment rate amortizes gains and losses over 15 years, and amortizes its unfunded liability over 30 years. This leads to a buildup of a huge hidden liability that has to be paid off by future taxpayers, or what I call intergenerational debt, through higher rates. Public pension plans need to adopt more reasonable accounting rules, either those used by the private sector under FASB or the new accounting standards, which we expect in the next couple of weeks from GASB. We also need neutral management. Public pension boards should be run with people with financial expertise who can be fair to workers, retirees, and taxpayers. The current systems with boards dominated by employees, retirees, and boards dominated by elected officials beholden to the public employee unions that put them in office is unacceptable. The investment performance at CalPERS, which is run and dominated by the public employee unions, is deplorable. For the 10-year period ending March 31st, 2012, CalPERS investment return is a cumulative 5.7%. In Contra Costa County, our retirement board is made up of 4 elected union and retiree members, 4 members appointed by the Board of Supervisors, and the elected county treasurer, which was me, which resulted in a more balanced board. Our investment return over the same 10-year period was 6.9%, or 1.2%, or 120 basis points higher. CalPERS, which is a $250 billion fund, this amounts to about $3 billion of underperformance a year, or $30 billion over the last 10 years. We simply can't afford this. We have to share costs equally. Government agency payments to the retirement system have 2 components: the cost to cover current benefits that are being earned by workers, and the installment payments on the mounting debt. The first part should be split evenly between workers and taxpayers. Currently, taxpayers usually pay most, and in many cases, all of the cost. This means that workers have little or no incentive for containing costs going forward, and workers should have to pay half these costs. Reasonable benefit levels. Pensions should be designed to provide a moderate standard of living, not a life of luxury. A benefit limit of 75% of salary, including Social Security for those that are eligible, for someone with a full career of 35 years or more, and Social Security uses 35 years. If workers want more retirement money, they should save for it on their own or work longer like employees in the private sector. We also need to end the practice of purchasing additional service credits. This is called airtime, which allows employees to buy additional retirement time to be added to their retirement without having to work for it at ridiculously low rates, because it's calculated using unrealistic rates and assumptions. The difference between the real cost and then the lower calculated cost ends up becoming part of the unfunded liability, which the plan sponsor and ultimately you, the taxpayer, have to pay for. We need to end pension spiking. Pensions should be calculated from base salary. Add-ons like uniform and car allowance, incentive pay and unused sick leave, and vacation sellback time should no longer be added into the computations. Pensions should be based on the average of no less than the top 3 or 5 years of salary, not the current single year, which is often the practice. Increase the retirement age. Why should public employees get to retire at age 50 or 55 while private sector workers are working until their mid-60s or longer? Social Security has been increasing their full benefit age for a number of years. If you retire at 62, you take a 20% reduction in benefits. The same should be true in public pension plans. And then finally, no agency should be allowed pension holidays in which it escapes actuarially required contributions, and this happened quite a bit in the 1990s. Future benefit increases should only apply going forward, and no retroactive benefits which no contributions have ever been paid or collected. Benefit increases should be approved by the governing board in an open, transparent setting for everyone to see. There should be no double dipping by collecting a pension while drawing a government paycheck. In other words, if you go to work for a second government agency after retiring from the first agency, the pension from your past employer is suspended until you actually retire. And then also, job-related felony convictions should lead to loss of a offender's pension. I believe most Californians would support these types of changes. If the governor and the state legislature won't implement these changes, then maybe we ought to ask the voters.
Okay, thank you. Actually, many of those items in your recommendations are either in the 12-point plan or been adopted by GASB. Yeah. Yeah, the key ones aren't. Yeah. Okay. Senator Mimi Walters, thank you for coming. I'd like to introduce you a little bit. You served 2 terms in the State Assembly, and you were overwhelmingly elected to the State Senate in 2008. You're from the 33rd District, which I believe is Laguna Niguel? Or?
Yeah, Laguna Niguel in a southern part of Orange County and works its way to the northern part of the county.
Okay, great. You were the founder of the California Women's Leadership Association, and you currently serve as vice chair of the Public Employee Retirement System. And you were a graduate from UCLA, but I will not hold that against you.
I know, when I walked into this building, I was a little concerned.
Okay, so with that in mind, you're going to give us some idea what's going on with the state related to pension reform,
Yes,
or what isn't going on.
Well, yes, what isn't going on is more accurate. Unfortunately, I'm concerned that the state legislature is not serious about pension reform. If you all remember when Governor Jerry Brown ran against Meg Whitman, and pensions were a very big issue in the campaign. In fact, I believe it was Meg Whitman who really brought that issue to the forefront, and it forced Governor Brown, at the time candidate Jerry Brown, to talk about pensions. And he kept saying, oh, I'm going to put forward a plan, I'm going to put forward a plan. Well, I had put forward 10 pieces of legislation that was a package of pension reform. And Senator Simidian had put forward some pension reform. And the governor hadn't done anything yet. And so then he decides, okay, we're going to have a conference committee so we can show the public that we're serious about pension reform. We're going to put together a conference committee. And we met for our first time last fall, which was, I think we met in October. He called me a couple days before we were meeting and said, Senator Walters, I just want to let you know I will have a plan for you at your next conference committee hearing, which was going to be in December. And I said, okay, so because what he did want us to do was to say that he wasn't serious about pension reform. So we had our first conference committee hearing, and quite frankly, it was just a dog and pony show. And then we had the second hearing where he came forward, and he said at that time, he put forward his 12-point plan, which quite frankly, I think he has some very good reforms in that plan. And he said, you know, this is the bare minimum that I'm going to accept when it comes before me when the legislature passes it. And so we were trying to hold his feet to the fire that he's publicly said that he's serious about this. But unfortunately, he also is a very good politician. And he knows in order for these reforms to get passed, they have to go through the legislature, which is controlled by his own party. And I believe, truly, and I'll be very honest and very blunt, and I know we're taping this, I believe he did this as a way to show he as governor is doing something, but really does know that the legislature isn't willing to have the courage to step forward and make the necessary changes. I mean, you all know, I mean, we have anywhere from $100 billion to $500 billion in unfunded pension liability in the state of California, depending on what studies you look at. We are facing a huge, huge crisis. And I have put forward legislation that gets killed in PERS committee. In fact, the only piece of legislation we have right now that is on the Senate floor to be voted on is for the state to create a pension plan for private businesses. That's what is passed out, and that is what is on the floor of the Senate right now. The conference committee is supposed to bring forward a report. Now, we had about 5 meetings, and our last one was in April, and we're still waiting for that report. I am not at all encouraged that there will be any sort of meaningful reform in that report. And quite frankly, I think the legislature, the majority party, wants to just see this issue go away. They want to maybe do a few little tweaks here and there, and then they can say we've had pension reform. But if we don't do something, we are in jeopardy in the state of California, and those people that are retiring in our state and are depending on this money for retirement may not get it. And that's the thing that concerns me as a legislator. I mean, we've got to protect those people who are retiring. Think about it. Who pays for those benefits, the pension? Taxpayers. You can only tax people 100% of their income, and then you can't tax them anymore. I mean, seriously, we're not going to be able to solve this crisis if we don't do something. What I think is going to happen is I believe that we're going to see change start at the local level. The municipalities are already starting to change. They can change because you don't have the special interests as entrenched in the local municipalities as you do in the state of California in the legislature. And you see cities like San Jose, who has an initiative on the ballot for pension reform. San Diego. You've got cities like Costa Mesa down in Orange County who are contracting out their services because they need to save money because they can't afford the pensions and the retiree health care that they're facing. So you see the local municipalities are starting to make the change. And what I believe will happen is it will start at that local level and it will work its way up to eventually get to a point where the legislature is going to be forced to make some sort of change. So the good news is part of the institution is forcing to change, and that's what this fiscal crisis is bringing about. That's, quite frankly, I think, an opportunity. When you have a fiscal crisis, you have to change, but the institution, it takes a very long time to change. But I believe in the long run we will see some sort of reform. I don't think it's going to be this year, and it perhaps won't be as comprehensive as I know I would like to see it, and I know people in this room would like to see it. But the good news is the people at the local level recognize if they want to survive, they have to make the changes.
Senator, if a scaled down pension bill passes, do you think that will hurt Brown's chances on his tax increase?
I don't think his tax increases are going to pass anyway. And I think it's the economy that's affecting the tax increases. And watch the June election. We have 29. That's the tobacco tax. If that goes down, which I think it will, he's going to be very nervous. Because if we don't pass a tobacco tax in the state of California, I don't think he has a chance of his tax increases passing.
Okay. One other question related to CalSTRS. Nothing in the tax increase or the pension reform addresses the severe underfunding in CalSTRS. And as I understand it, we need an additional $13,000 per teacher per year to go just to keep it solvent.
Right.
What do you think is going to happen with CalSTRS?
Well, I'm concerned about CalSTRS, and I think what we need to do is the legislature needs to back off a little bit, and they need to allow them to be able to have their teachers contribute more and take some of the burden off the taxpayers. But this whole unfunded pension liability, which Governor Brown doesn't want to address, nobody wants to address, is a huge problem for us. And you look at the rate of the return that CalPERS and CalSTRS are using, and Bill was alluding to that, and they're completely out of whack. I mean, we're not getting a 7.75% or 7.5% return on our money. We just aren't. My background is in finance. I was in the brokerage business for 7 years before I became an elected official. And if you look over time and history about the rate of return on investments, you can't just go back 10 years. You have to go back to the inception of when the plan started to see what real true rate of return. And we should not be putting in a 7.5% or 7.75% and assuming that type of return on our money. But this unfunded pension liability is a huge issue, and I do not know how that really gets solved.
Right. What about with retiree health benefits? It's related to pension benefits. I know you had a bill to require that if you promised your your employees' retirement health benefits, that you should set money aside, and it was voted. Did it even get a second?
No, I don't think so. Well,
In
maybe
committee.
Ted
Maybe a
Gaines
second.
seconded it in hers, perhaps.
But it didn't. It
But
didn't
it
go
died.
anywhere. Yeah, right. So I mean, the fact that the legislature doesn't feel that that promise requires funding tells me that they're not serious about that type of protecting that type of promise.
That's a whole nother can of worms when it comes to the retiree health care. I mean, we're on a pay-as-you-go basis. We are not saving money for our retirees' health care. And that's another issue that they clearly don't want to face. I mean, and let's face it, you guys, it's our grandchildren and our great-grandchildren, it's the future generations that are going to have to pick up this mess that we're leaving. And we have got to have legislators who have the courage to take on the special interest, to do what's right for this state, and stop letting them control them. If we're gonna truly make change, we got to have people that are willing to stand up and do what's right, and we just don't have it.
Are there any questions from the audience of Senator Walters or?
I'm not sure whether to preface this or not. I mean, we have an aging population, and we do have more people retired. You have more people selling investments to finance their retirements. That's going to put downward pressure on rates of return, as is all the debt that has accumulated in the global economy, because debt was financing expansion, which was generating higher returns than are sustainable. So with that preface, what do you think a realistic rate of return is?
Well, when I did my research, I ran for California State Treasurer a couple years ago. I got beat pretty badly, but when I was doing that research, we were looking at more like a 4% return. Yeah, it's more realistic.
Which is even less than the San Francisco.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Senator, if you went out on the street, on any street in Sacramento, I don't know how many people you'd have to talk to before you found a single person that really understands that their tax dollars are supporting the shortfall in CalPERS and CalSTRS, let alone any idea of what that shortfall is. And these are the same people whose current 401ks are 101 or 201ks. And so their retirement programs are going to hell in a handbasket as this economy continues to sink into the sunset. Yet their tax dollars are supporting a few groups of special people whose retirements are obviously more important than the rest of us. So when are you and the rest of the folks in the legislature going to start getting this information out so that the public will have some idea of what's going on and what the crisis is? You know, it's a train coming down the track, and very few people understand the significance of it.
I can only speak for myself because I'm a Republican, and as a legislator, I personally send out information on a weekly basis when it comes to pensions and the economy, and I have a newsletter I send out to almost 20,000 people. I mean, the best way for me to get my information out is, quite frankly, is through the social media. You can try to get, the TV guys to pick it up and the print newspapers to pick it up, and they'll pick it up a little bit, but we have to go out and try to get the message out ourselves. And you can imagine the state of California, we're a huge state, and as a Republican legislator fighting for pensions, I get beat down all the time. I mean, I had a piece of legislation that all it did was conform to what CalSTRS was already doing, and they killed it. And you know why they killed it? Because the unions are mad at me for standing up for the taxpayers when it comes to pensions. So now they've made a decision that any piece of legislation that Mimi Walters brings forward that has anything to do with pensions, we're going to kill it no matter what. And that's what we're fighting. That's what we're fighting against. And unfortunately, the public needs to be more educated, but a lot of people don't understand what pensions are. It doesn't register with them. It's not an exciting issue.
Benefit from the pension dollars.
Yes, they're members.
They're still members when they're retired.
Yes.
Yes.
So the higher that number is, the more money they get.
Their job is to fight for those guys.
Unions are benefiting from these inflated retirement packages.
Right. Do you have an answer on that one?
We have the $100,000 pension club. We have some union members on it, and we are releasing the new CalSTRS membership shortly. And just to give you an idea, the ADA last year was flat in California. Salaries, the average wages were down slightly in the private sector. Our $100,000 pension club in 1 year at CalSTRS has grown 25%. So there's no holding back on the lavish pensions. A lot of them, granted, are administrators, but we've got thousands and thousands that are being added to that list every year.
In Contra Costa County, we have our own $100,000 and over club, which our taxpayer group puts together. We have 645 members in it. One member receives $300,000. We have 29 in the $200,000 club. About 30% of them are firefighters. It's been said if you want to become a millionaire, work for the fire department, because that's where you're going to end up. But one thing, I know everyone likes to beat up on the public employee unions. I also beat up on senior management in local government agencies, because once these new benefit plans came forward, they saw how they were going to benefit. So you had senior management and labor negotiating from the same side of the table to the detriment of taxpayers. And I saw it in my county. I was the one that raised my hand and said, wait a minute, this doesn't make sense. And my county administrator and board of supervisors put the kibosh on me because of the fact that I was exposing how we couldn't pay for it. And 3 or 4 years later, when when the market started to fall, I was the one that they should have been listening to. My background is banking and finance for the last 45 years. Everyone likes to remember the great go-go times of 1982 through 1999, when we had the greatest bull run. Well, I was in the market in the investment side back in 1966 through 74, when the market, or 82, when the market was flat for 16 years. And so you're not going to make 7.75% a year in those kinds of markets.
Okay, I think we had one more question for the senator. Yeah.
Do you foresee more cities, for either anybody, do you foresee more cities adopting charters, becoming charter cities in order to opt out? And if so, do you think that would be a big enough focusing event for the for the governor to pass things and the legislator to get things through?
I think the cities will do whatever it takes for them to be solvent, because I served on city council for 8 years, and when you're sitting in front of constituents that are your neighbors that you live right next door to, and you can't offer them services, you can't offer them police protection, that has a very big impact on city council members. And I think the cities get it. I think for the most part, I mean, San Jose is a very liberal city, and for them to put this pension reform initiative on the ballot says a lot. And I do think that the cities understand, for the most part, what the problem is. And like I said, they have less pressure to make the changes because the special interests don't have much influence and power at the local level as they do in the legislature.
If I can just add, this is not a Republican problem or a Democrat problem, a liberal versus conservative. It's a math problem, and the math just doesn't add up.
Okay. All right, we'll move to the next speaker now. That was really great. Our next speaker is Dr. Lanny Ebenstein. He's an economist who teaches at the University of California, Santa Barbara, and I think you're missing class today as I... Right. Thank you. You're playing hooky. You're the president of the California Center for Public Policy, which is the main sponsor of this event. Dr. Ebenstein served 8 years on the Santa Barbara Board of Education and is the author of many books, some of which have been translated or appeared in foreign editions. Dr. Ebenstein's biographies of Milton Friedman and Friedrich Hayek were widely reviewed in leading publications including the Wall Street Journal and The Economist. And Dr. Ebenstein did a study recently, fairly recently, comparing public sector pay and benefits to the private sector. So he's going to be talking a little bit about what his study revealed.
Great, thank you very much. I think that these are issues that we're all familiar with, and the question is what can we do about it? And my thoughts today are going to be primarily directed in that way, as far as what are the practical political steps that can be taken to try to lead to reform of public employee pensions in the state of California. And the first point that I would make is that there's no need to demonize public employees or the services that government provides in this discussion. In fact, as was earlier mentioned, there are many prominent liberals, Jeff Adachi in San Francisco being among the most prominent, who recognize that unless government has funds to be able to provide services, that government really doesn't have anything to do with those resources. As far as if government doesn't have the ability to provide services, then government really isn't doing its job. So it seems to me that there really is the possibility for a coalition of virtually everyone except public employee unions, because it doesn't help schools, doesn't help public safety, it doesn't help many other functions that government services provide. So I think that to some extent this is an issue that can look for a broad coalition of everyone other than public employees. Now the problem is that public employees have such undue influence on the public process in California at this time. And for that reason, it's appropriate that there are measures on the ballot this November that are going to attempt to change the power of public employees in California, because until the power of public employees is reduced, we won't be able to have the common sense reforms that everyone here believes that we should have. So I think that in having a discussion on this issue, it's really important to change the dialogue in a couple of ways. One way is we want to make sure that we're not critical of the public services that are being provided. In fact, we want to see the public services that are being provided. It's a terrible thing when we're talking about cutting 2 weeks out of our school years across the state of California, when public libraries are cut down, when roads aren't being repaired, when parks are being shut. These are all things that are undesirable and should be able to create a broad constituency in support of public employee reform. Currently in the state of California, there's something like a $16 billion deficit that the state has. And it's a systemic deficit that isn't going away, which means there truly will be massive cuts in public services unless something is done. Now, one response is to say that the paradigm is, or the choices that face us are, we either have to raise taxes or we have to cut services. But once again, it seems to me that there's another approach, which is to say that we don't have to raise taxes, we don't have to cut services. What we have to do is pay public employees a fair wage, not a wage higher than the private sector, not a wage lower than the private sector, including all aspect of wages, including benefits, and in particular pensions. So I think that that's the other important aspect to try to convey to people, is that what we have to do is change the discussion from we're against government to we're in favor of government. We're in favor of government services. We want to see government provide a healthy amount of public services in our society, and that's precisely why we need to have pension reform, and we need to have other reform of public employee compensation. And at the same time, we don't have to say that the choice is either raising taxes or cutting services, but rather the answer is to pay public employees a fair wage. In Santa Barbara County, where I'm from, and Bill earlier mentioned some statistics elsewhere and at a statewide level, it's already the case that 1/3 of the county general fund budget in the county of Santa Barbara isn't being expended on current services for the people of Santa Barbara County. Instead, it's being expended on from the general fund on pensions for past employees. In future years, that will go up to more than one half of the county general fund budget, and there will be more beneficiaries than there'll be more beneficiaries of the Santa Barbara County Public Employee Fund, pension fund, than there will be individuals working for the county of Santa Barbara. And you'd think that at some point in time, people will see, the general voters, not the special interest of the public employee unions, but that the people at large will see that it simply doesn't make sense to have more people retired from working for government than individuals who are currently working for government, and that it doesn't make sense to pay more for pensions for retired employees than it does for salaries for current employees. What government does is important, and it's something that to some extent reform can take the thrust of trying to ensure that, as I've said, that we want to see that there are adequate funds for schools and parks and roads and public safety, and if that means we have to take on the current public employees who are representing some of the workers in those areas, that's a different issue than supporting the services themselves. We're for public safety. We're for public employee services. We're not for the current compensation of public employees, the way that works. You can be for public safety and yet at the same time say that any sort of pension programs that allow individuals to retire at age 50 with as much as 90% of their salary is something that is very unsatisfactory. So I think that once again, trying to stress that what government does is important, and that you're not necessarily, quote unquote, for public safety if you are saying you're for these exorbitant pensions for public safety, because in Santa Barbara County and in every government agency in the state, virtually, those exorbitant pensions are taking away from public safety. So in order to be for public safety, you have to be against public safety unions. And I think that there's nothing inconsistent in those two positions. As far as what to do, the problem, as has earlier been mentioned, is that the rates of return in government pension programs are vastly overstated at 7.5% and higher. On the basis of some preliminary calculations that the California Center for Public Policy has done, every percentage point that the rate of return is lowered in the state of California for all government agencies, CalPERS, CalSTRS, and then the independent city and county pension programs as well, probably costs something like $10 billion. So in other words, now that's at the local level as well as at the state level. But instead of looking at a $15 billion state deficit, we truly, if public employee pensions were correctly had rates of return closer to what market rates are, we would be looking at deficits of 20, 30, 40 billion dollars, and it's something that virtually every single government agency in the state of California would be in deep fiscal difficulties. And that's all almost describing what reality is in terms of every government agency in the state virtually is in a fiscal difficulty, and they're presuming rates of return that are very unlikely to materialize. So as reality begins to emerge on this issue, I think that in the coming months and years, that and each fiscal year, as we see huge cuts across the board in government services, that at some point in time people will say, either at the local level or at the state level or both, and I particularly like the idea of trying to focus on the local level first, is that people will say it just doesn't make sense to continue on the path that we're on. So what are the sorts of reforms that can be done? Probably the most important reform is to raise the retirement age. It simply is non-sustainable to allow one set of workers in the economy, public employees, to retire at age 50 to 55. That's the fundamental inequity in the system. I think that that's the issue that the average voter can perhaps become more personally involved with than anything else. Why are public employees being able to retire at 50 to 55 when if you're in the private sector, Social Security is going to 67, but you're going to be lucky if you're going to retire at age 70 if you're in the private sector these days. So, so basically, I think that that's a crucial issue to work at as reform, is to continue to emphasize the retirement age for public sector employees being far lower than it is for employees in the private sector. Another aspect, and this is where Marcia has done such good work, and that is with the putting together the list of employees, retired employees in the state of California who receive more than $100,000 a year. That number, as mentioned for CalSTRS, has gone up 25% in the past year. And the reason that the number has gone up so much is that it's not just that new employees are retiring each year who are going out at higher amounts, but it's that all the existing employees every year have that inflation escalator. So people who were even 4 or 5 years ago at 90,000, or who were 8 or 10 years ago at 80,000, they're going to be receiving 100,000 in the not too distant future if they aren't already. So that that too, I think, is something that is very appealing to voters, is that it's not just that one set of workers can't retire at a younger age than other employees, but it's that they can't be paid more in retirement benefits than other workers. And I think that particularly when you get to certain flashpoints, like $100,000 a year, that reform of the amount of pension benefits, I think, is something that will be public, that will be appealing to the public. And then the third aspect would be that, and we'll see what happens in Wisconsin with respect to Governor Walker, but certainly the experiment of public sector collective bargaining has not been a happy experiment either in California or anywhere else. And it's something that it's not just that it's financially unsustainable, but it's that once public employees have become the most important or the most powerful segment in the political process, particularly when it comes to political contributions, or one of the most powerful segments in the political process across the state and the most powerful segment in many jurisdictions, it changes the whole tone of government. I used to serve on a school board, and there really is a difference between the atmosphere of individuals who they can be liberal or they can be conservative, but if they're not, but if their overriding issue is protection of public employee pensions and public employee compensation, that changes the whole tone of government in terms of how you look at solutions to different issues. I can see people are saying my time is just about up, so I'm going to have to stop there. But just with any other further comment, it would just be that I think that these are issues that are going to, it'll be very interesting to see what happens in both San Jose and San Diego, and that will provide perhaps a model for other initiatives around the state of California at the local level.
Thank you, Lenny. That was great. Okay, our last presenter is going to be Ed Costa. He describes himself as a populist conservative. He's a board member and chief executive officer of People's Advocate, a California-based advocacy group attempting to suspend California's Global Warming Solutions Act, AB 32. You filed the petition and drove the 2003 California recall election against Governor Gray Davis, and helped get the Davis recall off the ground before the professionals took over, and that's why we got Governor Schwarzenegger, and the rest is history. I'm going to ask you one question, since we are here on USC territory, and you did have a fairly big exhibit at the Capitol the other day, the Trojan Horse, to voice your opposition to Prop 28. And I'm going to give you this in memory of that. Hold it up for the camera, since we are here. Give it. I am a Trojan, by the way. Sorry about that. Okay, you're an outspoken critic of Proposition 28. However, Willie Brown this week said he supports Proposition 28, which would modify the term limits for the legislators. And he said if we hadn't had term limits in 1999, SB 400, which retroactively increased pension benefits, would never have passed. And I would like you to talk about whether you agree with your friend Willie Brown or not.
It's hi everybody. It's absolutely not true, because the culture of the legislature at that time was such that a couple of us went down there to try and lobby against SB 400. And when we got to, my caucus, the Republican caucus, they kind of looked at me, and the minority leader says, "Ted," he said, "it's just so popular with our members." And so it went through the legislature. I believe one assembly person voted against it. It went through. And once that went through, then all of a sudden we have contract rights. And let me get to that, because we have here, you've heard everyone else, I don't want to repeat what they said, but basically we have a pension system we cannot afford. And then on top of that, to further burden us, we have this thing which everyone wants to call contract rights. I don't really believe they are contract rights, but they're called contract rights. If you go to Washington, D.C., and you see the Social Security system or the federal system or the military pension system, if the Congress figures they need tweaking, they just tweak them. There's no contract rights. But we have, because of the Betts decision and some other things in California, we have something that gives our employees special privileges that seem like no other employees in the whole country have, and that is these contract rights. But what needs to happen is just one simple thing. See, maybe you have the wrong bill. You need to allow the legislature to change future accruals of retirement benefits, and then you'll have the same power that Congress has. And that's what we need to do in California if we're ever going to get a handle on these pension systems. There's another way to do it too, and we actually drew one up and we filed it. We wanted to see what the ledge analysts would have to say about it. And we have the Pension Solvency Act, by which we say anyone who gets a $60,000 pension would pay $250, as long as it's unfunded, would pay $250 into the fund, to the PERS fund. And then it ratchets it up, graduates up to when you get a $150,000 pension, everything above that, 90% is taken. So the $550,000 pension that you read about, all of a sudden would be $160,000 when it gets done with them. And that's not interfering with contract rights, because when the thing gets funded, they will get their full pension. For a year, then it will go back under the old system. But that seems to be the major problem that we're having in the state of California. And with that, Marcia, we're getting to the end of time. I'll let it go, okay?
Got a couple minutes. Does anybody in the audience have any questions for the last two speakers? I have a question, Lanny, with you. You didn't talk about your study on what people make in the public sector versus the same exact job in the private sector. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. Well, I think that there's no question that public employees make more than comparable workers in the private sector. And the primary issue is one of benefits, as far as where the discrepancy is really the greatest is at the area of benefits. And it's not just in the area of pensions, but also in such things as days off, sick leave, holidays, personal necessity days. The fact of the matter is that public employees work fewer hours a day, they work fewer days a week, they work fewer weeks a year, and they work fewer years in a career before they retire with better public employee pensions that they didn't pay for. They didn't pay for nearly to the extent that they're receiving. So I think that it's primarily in the area of benefits that public employees are overcompensated in the state of California. Just to give an example, typical public day employees off would include sick leave 12 days per year, and it's a retained sick leave. So it's not use it or lose it every year, 6 days. In the private sector, it's 12 days that's bankable toward retirement. Holidays, typically in the private public sector, 10 days a year, and 10 holidays a year, and if a holiday happens to fall on a Sunday or a Saturday, then it's always taken on the preceding Friday or the following Monday. Personal necessity days, typically 3 days per year. Vacation, if an employee is working an average of 10 years, they could have as many as 22 days per year. The fact of the matter is that currently public employees in California frequently have 50 days a year off. That's 1 day a week. That's a 4-day work week. So it's something that there truly are inequities, and it's just a matter of trying to be as clear as possible, no demonization of individuals who hold these positions, but simply saying that the way the system has evolved over time is that one sector of workers in the population is receiving much better benefits, working conditions than other private sector workers.
I think with that, I think it's 9 o'clock. Is my watch right? And I really want to thank everybody for being here. You asked some great questions, and especially thank you to our panelists.
And on behalf of the Citrus Heights Chamber of Commerce, I'd like to also thank all of our panelists, our moderator, certainly our sponsors, and thanks to USC. Thank you.